We know that God is present when our eyes are open, and that when we give thanks, it magnifies the sense of the gift. And that's really the spirit in which we enter into our time together today, because we have this opportunity to explore a way of helping to facilitate and lead change that is rooted and grounded in this sense of appreciation and abundance, the abundance and the gift of God's creation. We have with us as our facilitator today someone who I think is a real gift himself. Frank Barrett, PhD, a professor of organizational behavior and change at several different institutions, both the Naval Postgraduate Academy in Monterey in the United States, as well as the Fielding Graduate Institute, was one of the originators of this methodology, which now over 30 years has become very mainstream, that we call appreciative inquiry. He is also a jazz pianist of fairly significant accomplishment and has played around the United States and Mexico, touring with the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra. He's written about the metaphor that jazz provides for understanding the creativity and improvisation that leadership involves. And he's got a wonderful book that I'd recommend about that metaphor that would stimulate your own sense of creativity, and how our work in synodality in many ways is beautifully expressed in the improvisation that jazz musicians do, each bringing their distinct gifts and bringing them into a harmony with one another. So I also would say that I'd like to celebrate something that Frank shared with Pablo and Sandra and I, and that is that he is opening himself up to God's reinvention of himself as he leaves behind his academic life for now, at least in the way he's been living it, and goes back to school himself to study theology for a second time in his life. As he goes to the Harvard Divinity School and enters into to studies again, bravely, like Ignatius, the eldest in his class, and willing to learn from the young people around him, but also to share his great wisdom. So please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Frank Barrett and to really making space for him now to lead us and guide us in a conversation with him about this wonderful practice of appreciative inquiry. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you, David. Can everybody see my screen okay? Yes, great. Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here. I've been looking forward to this. I'm thinking about how this is something I care deeply about. You know, I've been a Catholic my whole life and more committed Catholic in the last 20 years. I was taught by the Holy Cross priests at Notre Dame. I did my master's at the Jesuit school, so I had the Jesuit priests. And for the last 5 years, I've lived in a Benedictine monastery. So I've covered all my bases. I'm going to hold off for the Dominicans and for later, but I've covered all my bases. I've been around Catholic culture my whole adult life. And this issue of synodality is so important. And I want to just start by thanking all of you for committing yourselves to learning about it, because it is something we need to learn and get better at. The whole world needs to be good at it, but the Catholic Church in particular, I believe that our church is in your hands. And I should say our church is in your imaginations. And I really am grateful to David and the entire discerning leadership group for holding this hope out. And it's great to be on this learning journey with you. So thanks for including me. As David mentioned, and by the way, one thing, sometimes when I get going, I talk really fast. So if I'm talking too fast, anyone just, wave, raise your hand. I can see your faces, and I don't mind being interrupted. Appreciative Inquiry got started in the early 1980s at Case Western Reserve University, where I was doing my PhD. And a student who was about 3 years ahead of me named David Cooperrider, and our thesis advisor named Suresh Srivastava. And we were doing research at the Cleveland Clinic, sort of a world-renowned healthcare facility. And I want to say a little bit about the study because there's a lesson in Appreciative Inquiry. Suresh had read a book by Sir Geoffrey Vickers called Appreciative Systems. It's a great little book. Many people don't know about it, but it's a wonderful little book. And someone had done, a senior student had done interviews with the physicians at the Cleveland Clinic. And Suresh had read this book and said to David, why don't you take this data and do an appreciative analysis? And the phrase appreciative analysis, it means something else by Geoffrey Vickers, but they decided it was going to mean looking at the system when they're at their best. And so he took the same interview data and articulated a theory as to how this organization operates when it's operating at its best. And he wrote a paper on it, and he put forth 3 principles. He said, when the Cleveland Clinic, and by the way, the Cleveland Clinic is owned and operated by physicians, not by administrators, so it's a very different kind of system. And he said, based on what he's learned from the way this system was operating, the system operates at its best when it holds forth and stays true to 3 principles: a spirit of excellence, a spirit of inclusion, and a spirit of participation, inquiry. He wrote a paper on it, and Suresh said, well, why don't you share it with some of them? And actually, the paper was published in a journal called Human Relations. And the doctors read it, and the surgeons were going to have a off-site retreat, and the head of surgery read it and said, this is fascinating. I wonder if this is who we really are. He distributed it to all his docs, and he asked David Cooperrider and Suresh to come and do a retreat based on this theory of who we are at our best. And they got together and had this off-day retreat and began to look at how can we keep this spirit going, this inclusion, inquiry, participation, excellence. How do we keep this spirit going in our organization? Well, once the surgeons did it, the anesthesiologists had to try it. And department by department, every one of the departments ended up having an offsite studying who they were at their best and began to measure and talk about how can we bring more of this into our system. The reason I want to tell you that story is Appreciative Inquiry began as a research project. It began because the researchers were asking particular kinds of questions, and they discovered accidentally that it actually is a good intervention also, that it actually started to change the system they were studying. There's a moral to that story. And the moral is the questions we ask are fateful. And inquiring into a system from a stance of appreciation changes the system in the direction you're inquiring about. So the moral of the story is pay attention to what you pay attention to. And what you pay attention to is often a function of what questions you're asking. So perhaps deliberately ask questions that lend itself to positive dynamics. I usually start by talking about Latin, and it's a little risky to do with this group. I took Latin in first year of high school, so I don't know it very well anymore, but the word appreciation comes from the Latin word apprendum, and apprendum has 3 different meanings. One is to place a value on it. So I'll say something like, we need to appreciate the value of the house. That means you're going to value how much it's worth. The second meaning is expansiveness in value. It grows. So if I say the house appreciated by 15%, that means it increased in value. And the third meaning is to see or to notice. Appreciate also means to see or notice. So if I say, well, I can appreciate it from your perspective, that means I can see from your, it doesn't necessarily mean I agree with it, but I can look at it from your perspective. When you put those three meanings together, to place a value on it, to increase in value, to see or to notice. When you put those three meanings together, what it means is what I notice expands. What I dwell on gets bigger. And that's behind the spirit of appreciative inquiry. The second word, inquiry, comes from questar in Latin, and the same version of quest. And there's a difference between a journey and a quest. If you're on a journey to Los Angeles, the most important thing is, if you're on a trip to Los Angeles, the most important thing is getting to Los Angeles. If you're on a quest, the most important thing is what happens to you between here and Los Angeles. That you yourself, the searcher, gets transformed. I walked the Camino de Santiago across the north of Spain a few years ago. And that was not a journey. It was a quest, because when I left France and 32 days later arrived in Santiago, major changes happened to me. That's what happens with appreciative inquiry. Is when we're leading change from appreciative inquiry perspective, the change agent, him or herself, also gets transformed. So that's just a quick introduction. Let me see if I can get my slides to move. There we go. Let's see. Excuse me a moment. They seem to be a little stuck here. Okay. Yeah, so appreciative inquiry is a collaborative search to identify and understand the system's strengths, its greatest opportunities, and highest hopes in order to ignite positive change towards an ideal future. So the movement with appreciative inquiry, often change efforts operate like this. You do a quick diagnosis of the present and then start to articulate a future that you want to get to. That's the strategic change model. So you look at the dynamics and the problems and the opportunities in the present state, and then start to articulate a future. Appreciative inquiry goes a different way. You start with the past. You start with the past strengths. And from your past strengths, you articulate what an ideal future could be. And from the future, you come back to the present and say, now, if this is what we wanted, based on who we've been at our best, what can we start doing differently now? And it's a shift. I love this quote from Albert Einstein. You've probably seen this before. No problem can be solved from the same consciousness that created it. But I love this other one even better. There are two ways to live your life. One is as though nothing is a miracle. The other is as though everything is a miracle. So there's two basic questions behind appreciative inquiry, and it has to do with what our focus is. And so the first is, one, in this particular context or this particular organization, what has made this topic already possible? So if you're going to study collaboration and you want to increase collaboration in your system, you would start by saying already, what has made collaboration possible in this system? And then move to the future. What possibilities exist that are latent that could make something like collaboration or excellence or inclusion even better in the future? That's the way the inquiry moves. There are 6 principles behind this. I'm not going to go through all of these because I don't want to spend my whole time talking, but I think this is a good grounding. So you just get the theory behind this, and then we'll do a little bit of practice. The first is what we call the constructionist principle. And what it does is call attention to the power of language. Heidegger said, we're thrown into a world that already has a way of talking. And when that happens, that way of talking actually thinks us instead of us thinking it. So there's a way of language that makes a world possible, that makes the world show up to us in a certain way, such that we think we're speaking the language, but the language is speaking us because it preceded us. Another way of thinking it is, we create the world we later discover is real, and we create it in the way we talk. So the language matters. I remember once when I was doing some work at the Cleveland Clinic, and I was doing a presentation to the doctors, and I was doing a presentation of the work of Victor Vroom, who seems to have fallen out of favor in our field lately, but I was talking about how decision-making between supervisor and subordinates should happen. It was a theoretical model. And if you ever talk to a group and realized you're not making a dent, that you're just not connecting with them at all, and I could just tell nothing. I wasn't making any connection. I was going through this, and I'd studied it. I knew what I was talking about, supervisors, subordinates, and whatnot. And on break, I said to one of the physicians, I said, I'm not sure why this isn't working. And he said, we don't have subordinates here. Oh, that way of talking doesn't make sense here. My bad. I learned a good lesson, that language is fateful. And that's why I say we live in a world that our language creates. And we should pay attention to how we language things. I use the word language as a verb because it's an active doing. And it's often a habit. So if you want to, the philosopher Richard Rorty says, if you want to change a system, change the way of talking. If you introduce a new way of talking, you're either a revolutionary or a kook. So appreciative inquiry introduces a new way of talking. And I'll say more about that. And it leads to the second principle I call the principle of simultaneity. So the first principle is we create the world that we later discover is real, and we create it in the way we talk. The principle of simultaneity says we create the world we later discover is real, and we create it by the questions we ask. We're always living inside of questions. They're usually tacit, unconscious. So I wake up in the morning and say to myself, what clothes should I put on today? Who do I have to meet later? What do I need to get ready? How much time should I put into this? Questions are always in the background of our world. And I'll say, left to our own devices in this post-industrial age, most of our questions are deficiency oriented. Most of our questions are problem oriented. So the principle of simultaneity says change begins the minute you ask the question, not once you find what you're looking for. It starts the minute you ask. And it's simultaneous because the world and you start to change the minute you live inside that question. I'll tell a quick story of a study that was done by Case Western Reserve in the early 1980s. They were doing a study of stress. And at the time, it was the most elegant, well-funded study of stress that was ever put together. And what they did a classic study. They took half this group and gave them stress reduction treatments like smoking cessation, exercise, meditation. The other half of the group, they didn't do anything. And they gave them a base level measurement, gave them the treatment. 6 months later, went back and measured the level of stress, and were surprised to learn that in both groups, stress went up, including the group that was getting the stress reduction treatment. So they did it again. They said, let's try it again. So they gave them all these treatments, smoking cessation, meditation, exercise, sleep, how to pay attention to sleep, and discovered that in both groups, stress was going up. And they were puzzled by it. So if we step back and think about what I said about language, we may be able to have an answer to that question. What they discovered was one of the major causes of stress was the study of stress. And if you step back a minute and think about what's going on, when they give you a test, they give them tests at the beginning and ask them for major stressors. You've probably seen this. It's called a stress resiliency profile, I think. And they measure and they say, how many, if you've been divorced in the last 5 years, and you get like 80 points. If you suffered the death of someone close to you or sickness of someone close to you, like 70 points. Have you been divorced? Have you had sickness? Have you changed jobs? And you get a certain number of points for each one of these. And the more points you get, the more stress. And you can imagine what happens is Somebody gets their score back and says, geez, I got a 200 out of 300. That's not too good. Come to think of it, I did get that job promotion a couple of years ago, and it does interrupt my sleep. And my wife and I have been arguing more than ever. In fact, the other day, I was walking up the stairs and I felt a little tightness in my chest. They say tightness in chest is a sign of stress. Can you see what's happening? What this change effort has done is created a very elegant theory of stress. I know the antecedents. I know what leads to stress. I know what the experience is like. And I know the outcome of stress. It's an entire theoretical framework with this rich language. So it's little surprise that stress would increase in the system. If we step back, that's what I mean by saying the constructionist principle. We create the world we later discover is real and create it through our language. So pay attention to what you pay attention to. And more importantly, pay attention to what you ask about. I'm not going to go through the other principles right now because I want to get us into an activity. But to come back to this story, if you're trying to increase health in the system, why are you studying stress? That's what appreciative inquiry, that's how appreciative inquiry challenges us to think. Quickly, the poetic principle simply says that any human system is an open book and any topic can be studied. It's not the nature of the world that decides what you study. It's our own move. So I could, in an organization, I could study conflict. I could study status hierarchy. I could study alienation, or I could study collaboration. I could study excellence. I could study transformational change. The topic is a choice. So pay attention to what topics we do. I'll say one more thing about the anticipatory principle, because this is probably one of the most revolutionary findings in the field of psychology. It's called prospective theories, a book that just came out probably about 2 years ago. That there's a theoretical base behind change. There's a certain, for most of the last 200 years, our theory of change was, if you want to change a person, change their past. It sounds funny, doesn't it? But the whole field of psychoanalysis is based on that. Is if you're having difficulties with your boss, you go to psychotherapy, and the first question they ask is, how was your relationship with your father growing up? Let's go back and look at your past and heal that, and then your behavior in the present will get better. And we even operate this way. We hire people based on their past experience. We tend to emulate the past as determining what's going to happen next. There's another theory, body of theories, that says, no, what causes systems to operate, what causes behavior is the present. So in the field of psychology, stimulus response theory, B.F. Skinner, if you want to change the way people behave, change the reward in the current system. Our studies of organizational culture are really studies of the present state. And if you want to change behavior, you need to change what's going on right now. There's another body of theories coming out that says, if you want to change human beings, change the future. That what really guides our behavior in our organizing is the image we project to the future. That I'm always already projecting a likely scenario, and I act into it as if it's real, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Even our most hardcore social psychologists have come around to this, and there's a great new book out 2 years ago called Homo Prospectus by Roy Baumeister and Marty Seligman, two of sort of the fathers of very traditional social psychology. And basically they say in the book, we did not understand how important the future is for understanding human behavior. Now let's come back to us as change agents and as leaders. Think about all the ways we project futures, likely futures. It's possible that the best way to change a human system is to articulate a bold, enlivened future. That's what's behind another principle that's behind appreciative inquiry. I'm going to push forward rather than I'll talk about the other principles later because I'd like to get us into an activity. So what I'd like to do is, let me stop sharing screen. I ask you to please take out a piece of paper and a pen, a piece of paper and pencil. And I have some questions for you, and I'd like to just jot these down to yourself. You don't have to write full sentences, just phrases, words that come to mind, first thing that comes to mind. I have 4 questions. Question 3 has 2 parts, but let me just go through these with you and take a moment. The first question is this. I want to talk about the beginning, the current role that you hold in your community or your organization. So the very beginning, when you were first called into your current role, what most attracted you? What most attracted you to your current role? How did you feel when you were first called to become part of or connected to the community or the organization or your role in the church? What most attracted you? How did you feel when you first felt called? Talk about a time that most resonated with you when you were first called. Jot down a few notes. Second question. As you look back on your career as a priest or as a religious or as a layperson, as you look back on your career, I'm sure there's been ups and downs, high points and low points. I'd like you to focus on a high point, a time you felt most alive. Think about a memorable time you felt you were at your best, and you felt best about your organization, about your community, about the church. A time you felt inspired, maybe challenged or engaged or spiritually nurtured. Describe the times you felt best about yourself and what you were doing, and tell a story about one of those high point experiences. What was going on? What made it a significant experience? What was it about you, your personal qualities that contributed to it? What others were involved and how did they make it significant? What was it about the situation or your community or your peers that made it a peak experience? But tell a story about that, at least one time. And if you can think of 2, that's even better. When you were at your best, felt most alive, felt nurtured, challenged, engaged. Just jot down a few. Question 3. St. Paul reminds us to pay attention to our special gifts. Every person, every community has unique gifts and strengths. So first part is, what strengths do you bring? Without being humble about your strengths or your best qualities, don't be humble. What do you bring to your role in your organization, in your church or community, your special strength? And give one example in a way that you might have shared your strengths. And by the way, if you have trouble with this, if I ask the 3 people in your life who know you the very best, what would they say about you? Who are you when you're at your best? What are your special strengths? Second part of that question, I want to talk about your community or your organization. What are the special strengths of your community or your organization? When you think about your organization, your community, there are certain things that we do really, really well. You don't want to change as you move into the future. What are the 3 most important qualities or strengths of your community? And you decide for yourself which community you want to refer to, whether it be an organization, or your religious community, you whatever makes sense for you, but as a group and as a community, what are the precious qualities and practices that you want to keep and preserve? No matter what changes happen, those are the things you want to keep. And question 4, if you could change, develop, or transform your community or your organization in any way you wished, what 3 things would you do to heighten its vitality and overall health? If you could change, develop, or transform your community in any way you wished, what 3 things would you do to heighten its overall vitality and health? How would you change your organization or your community to enliven it, make it even better? Okay. Thank you for taking some time to do that. And I want to next take this a little bit deeper. Something powerful happens when we tell stories out loud to other people, and especially if someone's listening. I want you to pair up with one other person and ask each other these questions. But I want to frame this in a certain way. You know, usually when we ask somebody a question, we ask them a question so we can talk about ourselves. So I say, have you seen any good movies lately? So I can tell you what movies I've seen. That's a human characteristic. Or we think one way to show we're listening is to say, oh yeah, the same thing happened to me. I know exactly how you're feeling. I just want to call attention to that and ask that you edit or stop yourself from that kind of response. And as much as possible, pay attention to what the other person is saying and ask follow-up questions in a spirit of genuine curiosity. So don't interrupt and say, I know how that feels, or the same thing happened to me, but be a container for the other person's awareness. And I promise you that if you listen to the other person really well, they're going to get insights they didn't get when I just asked these questions in their own reflection. That's a gift we give each other, is real listening. Let me just ask, and you can raise your hand, how many of you felt a connection to your partner? Raise your hand. Good. How many saw new things in your partner you didn't notice before? Raise your hand. Interesting. How many thought about strengths inside your own self you haven't thought about for a while? Raise your hand. Yeah, okay, great. Well, thanks. I just want to call attention to this exercise we do. It's a mini version of imagine doing this appreciative inquiry process, starting the whole process in a large system with people telling each other stories like this as a foundation. Imagine doing it in a large system. We've done these, we call them appreciative inquiry summits with large groups. I've worked with groups up to 450 people in one room, and we pair people up and get the interview process started. And we stay with them for 3 days, 4 days. I'm going to tell you about some stories we did in the Monterey, California diocese. We worked with 2 different parishes and with the whole presbyterate, and did an appreciative inquiry summit where the group, we got them off site for a couple of days and did an entire process of change, starting with an exercise just like you just had, with very focused way. Let me take a minute, and I'm going to share my screen again and just say a little bit more about this process, and then I'll talk about some of the applications. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
What we're talking about is different modes of learning. And there's so much work on organizational change nowadays. And I always tell my students, whenever you see the phrase organizational change, you should think organizational learning, because change doesn't happen without learning. And we know a lot about the learning process. And I want to just pose 2 different ways to think about learning. One is problem solving, and one is more generative. You can see from the photos. And the steps, the problem-solving mode learns to adaptation. You identify a problem, you find out what the cause is, propose solutions, and they come up with an action. That's the way most of us operate. And again, it's very useful, and sometimes, and even as when upon occasion, we need to draw upon problem-solving adaptation, but that does not get you innovation. And I know in the synods, what you want to do is you want some innovative action. You want to at least explore novelty. And I want to say that in order from problem solving by itself does not generate innovation. It gets you back to status quo. If you're looking for novelty or breakthroughs or innovation, a different kind of learning is called for. I would call it generative learning. And it means appreciating and valuing the best of what already exists, and then move to the future, envision what's possible, talk to each other about possibilities, and then that leads to innovation. And I often use as an example Michelangelo's David. Is anybody here? I mean, many of you are Italian, so you know. Raise your hand if you've seen Michelangelo's statue of David. Yeah, it's absolutely awe-inspiring. I've been there a couple times, and I've gotten to the point where I don't look at David anymore. I look at the people who are looking at David, because they look like this. They're almost in awe, because this piece of stone looks like it could start walking. It looks so human. Now, somebody asked Michelangelo how he carved David, and his answer, I think, tells us a lot about this right-hand column. The piece of stone was left in Florence by someone else that was discarded as not being usable. It was a large piece of stone, and somebody said to him, "How did you do it?" And he said, "I looked at the stone and I could see David in there. I just had to clear out the rest of the stuff so I could pull David out." That's a very different way to think about learning. I mean, he also had to be a good problem solver. He had to figure out what kind of instruments to use, how to work with dust, how to keep the stone wet in order to get rid of dust, all those problem solving things. But what made it possible for him to create this amazing innovation was that he saw what existed at its best, in its most pristine quality, and focused on that. And that's what we could do in organizations. If we led change from that perspective, it could lead to innovation. One of the problems, we live in a culture of deficit-oriented discourse, looking at what's wrong, and there's a slippery slope. I don't know how that translates very well. I'm sorry for Spanish speakers. There's an accumulative power of deficit-based discourse that once you start focusing on when things are wrong, it takes on a life of its own. And some of the things that happens is it's a conservative way of thinking about change. It creates a tacit sense of hopelessness as people learn to live with diminished expectations. Or we become so deficiency-oriented, we assume something must be wrong somewhere, even if it's not raising its head at the moment. And you know, you have the saying that if you're a hammer, every place you look is a nail. In organizations, when we become real deft with problem solving, we become we commit ourselves to looking for breakdowns and develop a mystique language around it. And it leads to skilled incompetence, a phrase from Chris Argyris, where looking good is better than being good, because you just want to look like there's no problems in your area. And when we're in a state of defensiveness, it discourages experimentation. So we create this whole vocabulary of human deficit. I'll just let you know, in the field of psychology, in the year 1898, there were two terms to describe mental disease, 1898. If you fast forward 100 years, in the 1980s, when the DSM-3 came out, which is the codification of mental diseases, there's now over 10,000 terms that describe some sort of mental disease. And some of them have been coined just in the last 30 years, and you probably know some of them, right? Codependency, seasonal affect disorder, attention deficit disorder. There's a new one coming out recently, computer addiction. We become better at creating categories of deficits. When Marty Seligman, S-E-L-I-G-M-A-N, when he was head of the American Psychological Association, he was the world expert in the study of depression. He coined the phrase learned helplessness. And one day he was doing his research in his study, and his little 12-year-old daughter came to him and said, "Daddy, how come you always look so sad when you're doing your work?" And he sort of shunned her off. And the question stuck with him. And he said, "Why do I look sad? All I'm doing is studying depression. I wonder what makes me look sad." And it got into his imagination. And so he had his graduate students go back and look at how many studies in the last 100 years have been done of depression. And there were over 10,000. And then he had them look at how many studies have been done of love. There were less than 40. And he decided to start a movement that he calls the positive psychology movement. Because he said, as a field, we have overlooked an entire area of humanity because we're so addicted to problem solving that we just assume that's human nature. And it has wreaked havoc with our imaginations. And so there's a movement called the positive psychology movement. I can tell you about some of their studies, but I want to make time to talk about how we can pioneer in research across a number of fields. By the way, many of these findings in the field of social psychology were discovered by Ignatius, and they're in the Psalms. But I'll just talk about a few of these, but you probably know the notion of the placebo, right? When you have a placebo, when you're doing a study, and you give someone a sugar pill just to see if it has the same effect as the real treatment. In medicine, this is now required, and they've discovered that as much of 1/3 of a medicine's capacity to heal you is due to your belief that it will heal you. So your belief, your own belief system, your own imagination releases an entire pharmacy in your body. So the people who get placebo could very well have the same effect as a real treatment. And they found out if it's a double-blind test and the doctor thinks it's a real pill, the potential is double. And it says something about the power of relationships, that when we're in relationships, we're always already communicating to each other the future that we're anticipating. And it's probably very subtle. You probably also know the Pygmalion studies done in schools. When a teacher is told this third of the class is the smartest on IQ tests, this third of the class is in the middle, this third of the class is the lowest. So you can't expect much from them. But in reality, they were all mixed up. So the teacher didn't know it. But at the end of the school year, who always performed the best? It was the group that she thought was the smartest, even though there was no basis behind that other than her own expectation of her students. That finding is so powerful that they declared a moratorium on running the experiment. It's now considered unethical to do a Pygmalion experiment because the impact is so powerful. And if you step back and think about it, what it means is we literally make each other happen. We co-determine each other's performances simply by what we expect. So you think about when you hire a new person, you immediately have an image of what that person's capable of. Well, that image of what that person's capable of is fateful. You're helping that person become that. Think about all the ways we send out these images. I'll jump down to the bottom one, affirmative capacity. Studies done of athletes. When they're able to anticipate the perfect execution, it increases their performance. So for example, when bowlers, I don't know if you have does bowling make sense? Is it sport? Knocking down pins. With 1/3 of the group, they had them study nothing but their perfect strikes, perfect ball. 1/3 of the group, they studied their gutter balls so they could fix what they were doing wrong. So they would study videos of themselves and say, see how you changed your weight or you moved your wrist. And they tried to fix what they were doing wrong to get better. And 1/3 of the group, they looked at videotapes of half and half. At the end, who performed the best? The group that studied themselves doing a perfect strike over and over again. But that's not what's interesting. What's interesting is their rate of improvement was 100% better. They literally learned twice as well as the group that was trying to fix its gutter balls. That's why I say we need to tie this to forms of learning. And one of the most provocative sets of studies have been done with married couples by Dr. John Gottman at the University of Washington in Seattle, and maybe some of you have seen this. He can predict with something like a 90% accuracy when he meets a married couple. He can predict whether they will get divorced or not within 15 minutes. And his accuracy is astounding. The question is, what does he notice? What is he noticing that is clue into what makes this relationship sustain? He notices two things. Number one, the ratio of positive to negative comments between them. Number two, the ratio of curiosity to assertions. Now, how often are they curious and ask questions of each other? Those in a learning posture. And here's the shocking finding. The best predictor of healthy marriage says that the ratio between positive and negative comments needs to be 5-to-1. The most successful marriages have 5 positive comments for every 1 single negative comment. It's a very powerful finding. And I understand you're going to be working with Richard Boyatzis, a friend and colleague of mine. He's done some powerful studies as well, and I'll just give you a hint as to his. We're now redefining what psychological health means. And it has to do with the ratio to positive to negative inner dialogue, how much thought processes. And we used to think healthiness is good coping, being realistic, that the ratio would be 1-to-1. For every negative thought, you'd have a positive thought. If people considered biologically depressed, assessed as diagnosed as depressed, have a ratio of about 2 negative for every 1 positive. But the people considered psychologically healthy, their ratio is about 2-to-1 positive to negative. So for every negative thought, there's 2 positive thoughts. That group tends to thrive. They recover faster from surgery. They get sick less often. They report higher life satisfaction. And that's just the self-talk. So it's a powerful finding. And what it means is we used to think the healthiest people were the most, had a ratio of 1-to-1, positive, negative. And yet think about it, what these studies are saying is being realistic is bad for your health. You should err on the side of over positive. I'll just mention one other thing because this was probably the most powerful finding from a woman named Barbara Fredrickson. Her name will be on the next slide. She studied what's the effect of positive emotion, and it's connected with joy, interest, contentment, and love. What she discovered was, there's the name Fredrickson, that when people are in a positive affect state, it actually negates negative memories. It undoes them. That when you're in a positive emotional arousal, it actually has the effect of taking the power out of negative memories. Now think about that theory compared to the way we've always treated things like